Welcome to Smart Branding, a podcast dedicated to branding, naming, and domain names. I'm Tatiana Bonneau, and with my guests, we try to help you create and grow strong, memorable, and meaningful brands online. I believe time is one of our most precious assets, and so I want to thank you in advance if you decide to spend the next 30 minutes with us. I promise to do my best to make those worth it. Let's go. So my guest today is the CEO of Zamp, where him and his team are saving businesses from sales tax, as well as entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, investor. We'll talk about all that. So thank you for joining us, and sorry for messing your name up from the outset.
No, it's okay. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Tatiana.
Sure. Let's start with a bit of a background. Tell me a little bit about yourself. How did you get into entrepreneurship, and what led you to Zamp, which you're focused on at the moment?
Yeah, so my story with entrepreneurship, and I guess just a little bit about my background. I grew up in Michigan, and a lot of what I thought I wanted to do as a kid is, I wanted to go into build a company. I wanted to, maybe build my own biotech company, maybe work on the finance side. That's kind of what I thought was interesting, because you hear about a lot of these IPOs, Wall Street stuff, et cetera. So I ended up going to school in Philly, went to this school called University of Pennsylvania. I went there actually initially to kind of study business and engineering. And I was like, oh, cool. I'm going to build a company because it kind of makes sense, right? You can build things and you can sell things. But at school, you kind of get sucked into this Wall Street mentality of everybody, most of our class did consulting or, some kind of investment banking, private equity, or investing, or whatever that is. So that's, I kind of took the more secure route there, and I ended up doing that for a few years. So initially in my career, I was in the private equity space for several years. While I did that, I also realized that my group wasn't letting me invest in the public markets. And this is kind of how my entrepreneurship journey myself really began. They weren't letting me invest in public markets. And so I was it was between 2017 and 2020 or something like that, 2021, the market was booming. Everybody was making money. I see my friends investing in whatever, and I was kind of I have this cash, but I can't do anything with it. They won't let me invest. So what I did instead is I asked them, can I invest in real estate businesses? Yeah, absolutely. So I started buying houses. I started flipping houses, started doing full guts, renovations, all of those kind of things. And then eventually, towards the end of it, I had a team. And so I had a team that would be helping me flip these houses, do kind of renovations, and all that stuff. And I'd say that was my first touch point into entrepreneurship, because I was ultimately building something from nothing or on a limited basis, and I was creating something to sell to other people. And I was also managing a team of about 10 to 12 people. So then at that point, I actually thought about starting a prop tech company that essentially was a workflow tool for contractors, because a lot of us know that contractors are not the easiest people to deal with at all times. So I started building a tool. We're talking to engineers, getting our MVP out. At the same time, I met my co-founder now. His name is Edward Lando. I got introduced to him through a friend, met Edward Lando. And at that same time, I was thinking I love this thing that I'm doing on the real estate side. I love the fact that I can build something, sell it, et cetera. And as an investor, you don't really do that. You're kind of just investing and just sitting there, right? You're not really adding a ton of value into the business. You're not really building anything. And I was I really like that. Maybe I could do this at an early stage company. And this was when people were raising hundreds of $1 million rounds. And I was wow, I could see this equity grow. I could join an early company. It's going to be awesome. And so I talked to this guy Edward Lando. He also went to school with me. We were kind of the same year, not the same year. We were cross paths at school as well. Essentially, I was he's a prolific angel investor, built several companies. And I was hey, listen, Ed, I think, you built all these companies. I was thinking I could talk to him in the concept of, in the realm of joining one of those companies. So I'm going to join one of these startups that he's invested in early stage, so that I can kind of help build that company and be a part of it. Instead, he was hey, listen, I like you. Our whole team likes you at Pareto, which was the investment vehicle that he started. He's why don't you just come join me at Pareto? And you can keep investing and apply some of those investment skills, but we can also build companies together. And at that time, I was you know what? I came from a little bit of a conservative side where I kind of had jumped into that investing thing early from private equity days. And I was like, you know what, I can go earlier stage and try to figure out what exactly I want to do. I don't need to rush into it. So I stopped the other processes with companies. And I was like, you know what, I want to do this. The great thing was we invested in I think like a few, maybe call it like 100 companies, 200 companies, something like that a year, give or take. So you just see a lot of volume of deals. And you also see like what's working in the market and what's not working in the market. You get an understanding of which companies are struggling and which companies don't struggle. And so after a while, there was that element, just getting a lot more exposure early stage. And this is kind of how Zamp really came about. Is the second element was because we were investing in so many companies, a lot of them, as any investor knows, we always get portfolio updates. They ask us like a series of questions wherever they need help. Usually it's like fundraising, some form of like hiring, or like some miscellaneous section. And a lot of times in that miscellaneous section, I started to realize over the few months that I was at Pareto that people needed help with sales tax. And it was just like existing providers aren't good enough. Could you help me get in contact with somebody there? We are having an issue with these Nexus laws or the new legislation changes. Do you guys understand it? It was kind of this mix of they didn't really like the service that existing providers shared with them, and they didn't really understand the actual, the nuts and bolts of it. And so at first I was like, okay, I'm early at this. I mean, I'm one of the latest hires here. I'm going to add value by maybe partnering with one of the solutions out there, and it's going to be a consistent revenue stream for Pareto. And everybody's going to love me because I've created this like revenue stream for free. And then, I started talking to vendors and started getting demos and realized that they're just not that good. And they weren't really supporting businesses in the way that they wanted. And I think a part of it was because the two bigger ones out there are the ones that people use. They had been acquired. And because they've been acquired, the service started to suffer. The account management wasn't there. There was like a rotating door in terms of people. There just wasn't as much care for the customers and actually supporting them. And then just in terms of like the actual compliance, it was just getting sometimes it was wrong. So then I told Ed, I was like, I was thinking about building this prop tech company, and I know we kind of started on this. Like, I think we should pivot to sales tax. We should do this instead. Not like pivot that company, but start a whole new company. And so we kind of realized these acquisitions had happened, and that's kind of how Zamp really came about. We tried to look for a solution for existing investments. Then didn't really find one, and we're like, hey, I think we can do this better. And so like over the last year or a little over a year now, we've hired a lot of the people that have been in the industry before, from like sales to marketing to engineering to tax data, content, few state auditors. And so now we kind of have this like sales tax super team that's helping support and changing the market today. So that's a little bit about the background.
I like that, sales tax super team. It's like want to see it on a t-shirt. It's cool.
Exactly. I think we need to make like new hats for that too.
Yeah. No, it's very cool. Tell me about the name. How did you come up with Zamp?
Yeah, so we're one of those fortunate teams, I'd say, like fortunate groups that has a 4-letter domain name. And this it's kind of funny. Like my co-founder Ed, he's been a serial entrepreneur since we were in college. He's a few years older than me, and since college, he's just been buying a bunch of domain names. And so, like, I think like a few years before we started Zamp, he had bought like Zamp.com, and at that time, it was you could still get 4-letter domain names, and we just had when we started Zamp or when we started this like sales tax company, we were like, what should we name it? We went through like tens of hundreds of different potential names, and none of them really quite fit. And he's like, hey, by the way, like I have this domain that I've been sitting on for a while, but I've been saving it for like a company that I think is going to absolutely crush it. And so he's like, I was like, what is it? And he's like, oh, it's Zamp.com. And I was like, you have a 4-letter domain name called Zamp.com, and it's basically like ramp.com. Like, what are you doing here? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, okay, let's use this. This is great. This is awesome. And so we kind of agreed upon it then. And it just, and it kind of made sense because it was kind of sounds fast. It sounds, like exciting. And for us, sales tax is not exciting. Sales tax, nobody likes dealing with that stuff. It was like, how can we make it a little bit more exciting from a branding perspective? And then that speed of it, when it comes to sales tax, taxes, anything government related, everything's always like relatively the slower side. So it's also instilling that element of speed within customers' mindset that, hey, if we use Zamp, then it's going to get delivered. So and there's like a bunch. Yeah, and there's also like a bunch of like little word plays that you can do where it's like zamped up or anything with amped up, and I'm a huge proponent of the word amp. So
I was just gonna say, it sounds like a verb. It sounds like immediately you think like that's a verb in some language.
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally that's maybe we'll get shirts for everybody that say like you've been like zamped up or something like that. But yeah,
no, I love it. I think that's very funny that like you're not the first. So in your case, it's your co-founder, but a lot of serial entrepreneurs end up with like a bunch of domains that are sitting there waiting for the right idea, the right company to come along. And it's really cool to hear those stories.
Yeah, 100%. And it's funny because ever since he told me that, I've started buying my own domain names, whether it's like for a business or whether it's like for other things. And I'm just like, maybe this won't happen or maybe it will, but I've heard so many stories of like, I have a friend who has the domain name like the.com, and like people have these like pretty insane domain names. But if you think about it, if online commerce is going to continue, if people are going to continue to build companies online, and maybe there's a world in which things get off of like the web, but in this call it next 5-10 years, let's say we're just continuously building online, a lot of these domain names are going to get taken up really fast. And so the value of your domain name, whether you use it or not, also it almost becomes like an investment, right? So kind of interesting.
Yeah, although it is fair. That's pretty much what I do. But it is very much like it is real estate online. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely.
Like a little bit more, I mean, like you.
Yeah, and I think it's like a little bit more defensible than like like I don't know if you followed a lot of that stuff that happened in like VR where people are buying like farms on like some virtual reality thing or whatever.
Oh, is that still happening? I'm like, no, I don't. I know there was a. Is that still going on? I'm not like. I didn't follow. I thought I'm too old for that, but then like honest, it didn't stick around for long enough for me to like jump into it. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah, I was getting a little bit concerned because I was like had friends like buying acres and whatnot. I was like, oh god, like am I late? Am I late on the trend? Like I don't want to be late. One of the things I've always told myself is like I'm going to catch the next trend, and I never want to be in the trend. and then I like a few months later, like all this stuff is just devalued. So like nothing. So I don't know if I'm still doing it or not, but it's definitely not doing super well.
Yeah. No, the domains are, I mean, literally, I think it's this month, it's 40 years since officially the launch of the domain name system. So like, I know it sounds crazy and it makes you feel really old, but domain names have been there for 40 years, literally, like out.
Yeah. That's crazy. And I guess that's like the whole like GoDaddy business is based on it.
A lot of So you mentioned you've invested in a lot of businesses and worked with teams that invest in businesses. So like you've seen a lot of ideas and a lot of things that worked and didn't. Would you be able to point out like some like really red flags, like for something that you look at it and go, okay, that's not going to work?
Yes, I think there are certainly red flags. I think for us, it's a mix of things, right? The first thing that we ever looked for, I mean, it's just a team. The team is really critical to this. And I think if the team, the founders, the group isn't like fully bought in and there isn't like an aligned vision, I think that's an immediate red flag because at that point, you just don't have direction for the company. No matter how good as an individual contributor you are, no matter how good of a person you might be or an operator, if there's no like direction and there's no passion for the building a business, it's really hard because you're not just maintaining a business, you're actually building this thing block by block. So I'd say team is like super critical, and that's something that we really pushed in on, both from like a early stage standpoint. And I've seen companies that are pre-revenue, and I've seen companies that are hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. And so at all stages, the management team and the team that's leading it, highly critical, because right now we're in a pretty tough time. If you don't care enough about the business, you might just throw in the towel. You might not make the right strategic decisions for the business. So that's where I think it really matters. The second thing I think in terms of red flags is I always tell people, like, when you're starting a business, you really have to answer two questions. The questions are, why now? Like, why is this specific time? Why is this the right time to start your business? Is there some market trends that are happening? Is the recession helpful to you in some way? Is there, acquisitions that have happened in the market that have opened up the gap for you? Why now? Why is it that you want to be building this specific company now and not 5 years ago, not 5 years from now? And the second question is, like, why are you the right person to build this company? And that really goes back to that first point of, like, the team, but it's also like, what is your differentiating aspect here? What is your wedge in the market? Like, how are you approaching the solution that you're providing the ecosystem today? It's a lot of those things of, like, if you can answer the why now and the why you questions, a lot of those red flags will slowly come up because you can't answer those two questions. And so I wouldn't say there's, like, a specific red flag of, like, oh, this is a bad market, or, oh, this is the the wrong financial metrics. I think financials are obviously key, but, like, early stages, like, that's not something people look at. I think those are the two big things. And if you can't answer those for yourself, or even, like, to investors, I'd say that's a pretty big red flag.
Would you say the name and domain name, because I'll give you an example. There was a very popular interview with the founder of Calm, and they initially launched on calm.com, which was, like, normally the people I work with that come to acquire premium domain names, they already have raised some money, proved their concept. They know they're going to stick around for some time in order to invest, 6, 7, whatever figures in one word short.com domain name. But those guys from Calm, they actually took a pretty much huge risk, what you would say, and they put 6 figures into a domain name out, from launch. So it's something that a lot of people would even advise you against, but it worked for them. And there was an interview with them where they had some of their first investors citing basically that as the reason to trust them, saying, if they got that name, that they're obviously here to stay, they're trustworthy, etc. So from your experience, does that matter, the name of the company and the domain name?
I think that's a tricky question, because I think I've seen companies that have pretty awesome domain names, but they're not great companies. When you look under the hood, I think I've also seen companies with not that great of domain names, but they just absolutely crush it. So I think it's, like, a maybe answer, I'd say. But I do think that, like, for us, for example, there's other companies that are called, like, Zamp in the ecosystem. Like, they don't do the same things that we do. There's, like, a Zamp Racing. There's like a solar company and whatever. But the nice thing about having the domain is, irrespective of where people hear about Zamp, they first go to zamp.com. They don't go to the other. They don't necessarily go to the other domains first. And I think that's in some ways, there's, like, some value to that, is having the arrow point to you first, and then you can point it in the right direction beyond that. I don't think it's necessarily, I believe in having those strong 4-letter domain names, also just from a marketing perspective, because if your name is hard to pronounce, or if your name is, like, hard to say, it might, or, like, hard to spell, it might not stick as well with customers or with people in the ecosystem, right? So when people are talking about it, they're not like, wait, what was that company again? Like, I don't remember. I forgot how to say that company's name. And I think there's a lot of times where I've heard that specific phrase said a lot, where it's like, wait, how do we say that again? Like, I don't really get it. But there's other times where the companies that just stick, right? And you're like, oh, this is the name of the company. And from the ability to recall perspective, I think names are, like, super critical from a marketing perspective. But that doesn't mean that, I think there's other companies out there that have done pretty well without having those names, and there's also companies that have had great names that.
Absolutely, yeah, I completely agree with you, and that's kind of I say that often. I don't think any name or the matching domain will save your company if what you offer is not good enough. That's just not going to hold. So, but on the other side, if you do have a great product, a great team, you mentioned a few times, a great company, then it's an advantage to have, a good name and a good domain. So why not have it? Why not give yourself that advantage?
Yeah, exactly. I think you're right. Like it helps more when you're doing well and it's easy to say versus like when you're not doing well, it kind of doesn't really matter like what your domain name is.
It's not gonna save you. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that, going back to this thing about like red flags and just domain names and stuff, if your product just isn't good or it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, you're gonna your bucket's gonna leak at one point or another. So the domain name shouldn't be like a substitute for your product. It should just be like an enhancer for your marketing. So.
Yeah, you said it very well there. Very cool. You should do your marketing yourself. You word things well.
I appreciate it. It's funny. I write like content on LinkedIn pretty regularly, and then I also help like our marketing team. So hopefully like some of that is bleeding into.
Yeah. Cool. Talk to me about Zamp. Like what exactly do you offer? Because we touched on it a little bit, but like when you say taxes, people are usually like, oh, So what do you what do you do exactly?
Yeah, so we provide a managed sales tax solution for businesses. So every business that's selling in the United States has to deal with sales tax. Meaning there's kind of three buckets. They have to know when to charge sales tax on like a transaction with the customer. They have to know how much of sales tax to charge. And they also have to be able to know once they collect that sales tax, what should they do with it? And so that's what we really do. We help companies kind of address that sales tax element of it. And as a customer or consumer, a lot of times you don't really see that. Because whether you go in Europe or in the US or wherever, you're usually just paying that tax, right? Like you go into the market, you pay the VAT tax. In the US, same thing, like you go in, you just pay the tax. But on the back end, there's a lot of calculation and compliance that really needs to happen. And that's ultimately what we take care of for the businesses. And so today's providers, what they do is they say, hey, Tatiana, here's a software for you, but we're not going to do everything for you. You're going to have to find a third party or a team to manage that software. And you kind of see this today with like QuickBooks, with a lot of accountants managing QuickBooks, right? Similarly, there's a software, usually an accountant manages it, outsourced CFO team, like an internal team, but somebody's spending hundreds of hours a year managing the software. What we've done instead is we've kind of come to the market and said, why, like people just don't want to deal with it. Like to your point, like people look at it and they go like, taxes, They just, but they do want to make sure that it's getting done right. So what we do is we say, hey, we're going to give you the software that that providers give today, but we're also going to add that element of the support and services that you're getting from outside parties, these third parties today. So we combine into this thing called a managed solution. And a lot of that's, a lot of it's just tech driven because we kind of support the end-to-end compliance piece of it, from calculation all the way to filing the taxes, the registrations, et cetera. We can use technology to help drive a lot of the operational efficiencies internally. So that's kind of what we do for businesses. And our whole goal and the mission is ultimately to take sales tax off our customers' plates so they can focus more on growing the business. They can focus more on profitability. They can focus more on the more important things to them versus sales tax, which is just a cost center. Like they're not making any money on doing sales tax. They're just doing it because they have to do it. So that's what we do for companies. We support companies that are e-commerce, CPG businesses, software companies, digital services companies, anybody that's doing multi-channel / online sales, selling into the US. And then eventually we'll also get into supporting like international businesses and the VAT side of it and whatnot too. So that's a little bit about what we do. Hopefully that was more helpful.
Cool. I was going to ask you, who is it suitable for, but you kind of answered that now. And touched on my other question because again, to touch on the domain name, Zamp.com is a pretty global domain name. And a lot of times when people launch a business and they're based in one country, especially with you, like you're dealing with tax, it's not that easy to just expand to different countries because of the regulations and etc. Always different. But you launched on that name, but we covered how you got to have it. So you have that sorted, like you're open to expansion from the outset.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like to your point though, every country, every region is going to have their own, because we're a compliance and tax tool, they're going to have their own requirements. And so we're just going to have to be extra conscious about keeping our customers compliant with those requirements. Fortunately, we have people on our team who have not only done US sales tax, but they also have experience with the international markets, whether it's Europe, whether it's India, whether it's Australia, et cetera. And so we can kind of help address some of that with the experts that we have on board today.
And you said you still have like human input. It's not all automated. Am I getting that right? Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, the part that really that's really important is when we onboard the customers, we want to make sure that we're putting our best foot forward. We're holding their hand. We're making sure that we get their data. We're making sure that we set up their accounts. That onboarding piece, I don't think will ever be like fully automated. There's going to have to be a human element because there's so much value in having that face-to-face interaction with somebody. Because today's providers, they do this self-serve approach. They say, hey, Tatiana, here's the product, you onboard yourself. Accounts get set wrong, things aren't implemented correctly. That causes downstream issues for them later on. And that's why there's all these support questions of like, oh, like I messed this up, like how do I fix this? And so like onboarding will always be that critical element. Then it comes down to calculation, which is automated by our system. We recently launched an API that does rooftop accurate calculations that is done automatically based on the inputs we get. And then beyond that, the compliance element, the registration, the filing, that's also kind of slowly being more and more automated because we have the customer data already. So how can we continue to aggregate it and transform it in different ways and put it into files? And the last piece I'd say is maybe it was going to be like a last thing that we think about automating, but maybe not, is really when the customer gets emails from the state and they say, hey, Tatiana, like, your pet food business, we think that there's an issue here. You don't want just like an automated email responding to the state being like, oh yeah, like, you know what it is. You know what I mean? That's kind of where like the experts that we have come in. One of them is, her name is Nicole Power. She leads our compliance team. She's been a state auditor before. She's been on the filing side for several decades. She's currently working with a lot of governments on a piece of legislation called it's like a unified power of attorney. And the interesting thing is when her and her team get these notices on behalf of the customers, because they have that relationship with the states, that becomes really important in helping us address this quickly and swiftly for these customers. And so that piece of it, I don't think will ever also go by the wayside, but those internal elements will definitely continue to become more and more automated over time. So, but this also means that we don't really have support costs much on the back end, largely because we're doing everything for the customer. So the customer, like, we send them like the regular emails, we give them a cadence of like, hey, this is what we're doing for you. This is what we need you to do, or this is where we need your help. And we kind of keep in touch with them consistently. So because they don't have that, all those questions that they're asking because they're doing it themselves, they don't like really exist anymore. And so instead of us allocating those costs to support, we've maybe cut down like 80-90% of those costs and allocated them towards like talking to the customers throughout the value chain. And so net, I think it's even more tech automated than what existing providers are doing today. And it's giving them a higher level of service.
That's very cool, actually, and very curious when you think about it, because now, especially with like recently AI and ChatGPT and all the chatbots have been around for some time, but like everyone is hyped up about it more now. But everybody threw themselves into that, like all automated, generated discussions and supports and chats and all that. And in a way, the goal is to minimize costs of communicating with those people and answering the questions. But what you just said and what I'm absolutely seeing happening is it actually leads to completely the opposite. Plus, on
100%.
top of that, you have people annoyed. Like, I mean, like I myself can probably pick 3-5 cases of that just in last week alone, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. And it was going to be another question, but we kind of started talking about it already, that the impact of especially artificial intelligence. And I think it's really smart what you're doing there, where you have looked at all the processes and analyzed which ones you absolutely should not be replacing. And even though it looks like really like onboarding, that's like, time consuming and a lot of work. And when you think about first the impression that it gives people, like you're talking to a real human, and the fact that it saves you, as you just said, so much on support afterwards, and that connection that you build with your customers, it's really invaluable.
I mean, you said it better than me, but we see this with every human interaction, right? When you meet a person or when you meet somebody, that first interaction or those first like two interactions, I'd say are probably the most critical to building this relationship that you have. Once you've made that interaction, whether it's with a product, whether it's with a person, it's hard to shake that specific feeling. And yes, there are those people in the world that are really good at giving you a new chance or new opportunity with a fresh, like a fresh canvas sometimes. But most people, they don't. It's one of the biggest reasons why we have our phone number on our website, is because I want you to call us so that we can answer your questions. Even if you don't decide to go with us as a provider, I want to be able to say that, hey, listen, you had a question related to sales tax or something that we're doing or something on our website. We were able to answer that question for you and you were able to reach us readily. And we've been doing customer case studies now. And that's probably the number one thing that we hear over and over again. It's just the fact that, hey, I don't have to wait days or weeks to get an answer. And over email, I can reach out to you guys whenever I want. I can get an answer in minutes or hours. And that urgency, or that ability to communicate with a human, I think is like super critical. And we hear it over and over again from customers. So it's kind of like, why would we stop investing in something that's giving us the wins versus like, I think that's what helps drive our conversion rates much higher than what they exist in the industry today. Versus like, let's just push top of the funnel as much as possible and keep our processes the same. And maybe our conversion rate is really bad, so we're not focusing on optimizing the middle or the bottom, but we're just trying to push as much volume from the top. But why not just actually try to get as many of those, the ones in the middle of the funnel or the bottom of the funnel too? So a different way to think about it. And I think AI has its places. I think it has its places in creating efficiencies and optimizing maybe internal processes. But for us specifically, we don't want to have AI necessarily responding to compliance and risk related questions, because at that point you do want somebody. It's like when you do your taxes, like if you had a question on your taxes, they don't want like an AI bot to be like, oh yeah, Tatiana, like I think you should, and you're like, wait, you don't know everything. Like I need to talk to somebody that knows.
Absolutely. It's funny because I actually studied accountancy. Never worked it. I'm actually like really bad with money. Honestly, I'm like just spend. Like my solution is always make more money. But I studied it anyway. And it's very funny because the first year and a half, we had one teacher who was like just teaching us. And she actually never worked as an accountant. She was just giving us the theory. I thought that's just the stupidest thing ever. Why is it not automated? Like, why do we even bother doing this? It's just ridiculous and boring and whatever. Then we had a different teacher who came and she was like one of the best accountants. Like she was doing it almost as a charity, teaching people, because she had like work up to here, and companies like calling her all the time. And she just like threw everything that the first one has told us in the bin. And it was just like, no, that's not how it's done. Like, basically what I was thinking came out to be the right thing, which is like, if you're just going to do it by the book, so, 2 + 2 = 4, you don't need a human for that. But 100%. Like the creativity of it and, following stuff, like, you know what I'm talking about. It's just, and it made it exciting and interesting as well. And this, you can apply that to just about everything. I think there are places where AI can absolutely and will and does enhance performance and improve things, but there are some things that, in a way, I feel that what people were fearing, like AI would replace us, I think it would actually make those skills stand out and be appreciated even more.
For sure, I agree with you, and I think like especially when it comes to like legal stuff or law, or I mean tax in itself is just kind of law in some ways, and you kind of said this. There's so many interpretations of this that you kind of need to have experts that understand. Okay, like does this product that I'm selling, does this correspond to this specific law, or this like how should we interpret this? And I think even like when you sell a product, I think what we talked about is like the customers need to know, when to collect tax, how much to collect, and how to, remit this tax. That first element of like when to collect it, sometimes, customers cross thresholds where technically the right thing to do is like, register them and make sure that they have like a business entity and all these things. However, does it make sense from a financial perspective? Does it make sense from a business perspective? Maybe not. And that's kind of where the experts that we have come in, because I think our team is less than 20 people and or like around 20 people. And we have around about like 150 years of experience on sales tax. And I think on a per person basis, that's pretty significant versus like anybody you look at out there. But that's what helps us. That human element is something that the human element with experience is something that helps us support our customers in the right way and align with them and make sure that they are making the right business decisions versus just being like, oh, we're just going to try to sell our product and just push it on you, right? And there's a lot of vendors that do that today. And for us, I think the most important thing is let's build a partnership with the customer. So we're actually helping you enable your sales, enable your growth, and we're just here in the background as like a part of your organization that you don't really want to talk to.
Pretty cool. Yeah. How would you scale that? I mean, that's one sort of an issue that many people have when it comes to like human interaction, all of that. When you're relying on that, you can scale people. How do you look at that in the future?
I think the key thing to realize is the fact that when you think about the bulk of the work is not being done. Like there's a lot of work being done on the onboarding side, and there's a lot of work that's being done on the the customer support side, call it, where you're addressing the needs. However, a lot of companies today, they spend so much money and resources in investing in other things where they could be investing in this specific aspect. So when we think about scaling, onboarding is just a one-time thing for the customer. And so if we're investing in onboarding, that means we're bringing on a lot of customers. We can probably invest a little bit there to help support them. The other thing is in our specific market in the industry, because we're doing everything for the customer, like I said, we don't have those support costs in the back end. So we're basically, let's say your support costs are 100%, we can cut 80 to 90% of those. But for us, like even if you use an AI chatbot, no matter who you are, like you're not cutting those costs at 80 to 90%. Like there's just no way. And so those costs get like onboarding means our business is growing, but then on the back end, if there are questions that the states have, usually it's because you're not compliant. But because we're doing it for the customers, those questions are also reduced by a significant amount, by like 4 to 5 times, if not more. And so it kind of, the question becomes like, we're just investing in like onboarding and account management, where we're helping with renewals, we're helping customers, getting their feedback, understanding what's going on there. And then we're also helping them set up their accounts. So I don't necessarily think those are bad things. I think those are good areas to invest. Where I think it's a bad area to invest is like in our industry, where I think it's like, I'm just going to hire a bunch of support reps, offshore and hope that they're answering the questions based on like this like packet of like 20 pages and like let them sift through it, which I'm like, those support costs as your customers grow are only going to grow. So how can you make sure you limit your support costs? And I think that's the biggest questions businesses need to ask themselves is, how do you limit your support costs that scale exponentially to how your customers scale? And I think in the beginning, even like the onboarding flow for us, there are going to be parts where it'll get more and more automated as we start building out more and more product. And so maybe one onboarding person today can onboard 100 customers a month. Maybe like here it's going to be 200. I just don't think that investment is worth it.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and it absolutely makes sense. And I love the way you kind of you pointed out the support reps, and it's something that people see almost as a good sign. You can even say, "Oh, we're getting so many questions. We need more support reps." And when you were just saying it, I'm thinking that actually should be a red flag. You should be thinking there's something wrong. Like if I'm getting that many people asking that many questions that I have to handle, there's something wrong. There's not, there's something wrong with the process. It can be improved.
For sure, 100%. And I think there's a lot of people that are like, I think different solutions are different, but I think specifically in the risk and compliance space, people have self-serve solutions where they tell the customer, "Hey, you do it." But these markets, they to your point, like the customer just knows what they know by Googling and like whatever, but they just don't know what they don't know. And obviously they're going to have questions, but if their questions can get addressed from the beginning, they're not going to panic when they do have, a question here or there. And you're not going to have like support requests like inundated. So I don't love the self-serve option a lot of times. And I think, another company that does a great job of this is like Carta. Carta like makes sure that when we onboarded with Carta, they made sure that they answered all of our questions from the very beginning. But now I don't really have any questions. Like they kind of answer everything. I think Gusto or JustWorks or companies like that they do a great job of this as well. So again, these are all like businesses in that like compliance and risk space that are doing pretty well. But yeah, some of that inspiration comes from there too.
Cool. Last question. We are coming up to the end of the year. So what are you looking forward to? Where do you see Zamp next year?
Well, this year has been really exciting for us. We launched our product in May and we've been scaling really quickly. Some of our investors are, calling us one of the faster growing SaaS companies out there of the year. I think next year, that's great. But the next year is like, how do we continue to drive that urgency? How do we continue to scale as a business? So it's kind of the same thing that we talked about is it's great that we're getting top line revenue and it's great that we're bringing in business, but how do we make sure that we support these customers efficiently so that we're not just burning capital on the bottom end? And that just comes down to automation, pushing on more efficiencies. And that's going to be a huge focus for us next year. It's that automation and ops efficiencies and building out more just product efficiencies for the customer. So I'm excited about that. There's also going to be some interesting things that we're cooking up for the customers along the way as well. So it'll be interesting to release that and get their feedback.
Oh, some t-shirts.
Yeah, a little bit.
Cool. Well, that's been an absolute pleasure. We'll include all the links of where people can reach you and Zamp with the podcast. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Tatiana.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of Smart Branding Podcast. Feel free to visit smartbranding.com for more information and reach out if you have any suggestions, questions, ideas, or just want to learn more about how a good domain name strategy can help you build a strong and successful brand. See you next time.